Imagine a world where empires are crumbling, where land is fought over by different peoples, and where only the strongest can hold on to power. This was the scenario at the end of the 5th century, a turbulent time that saw the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, leaving a power vacuum in Europe. In the midst of this turmoil, one man stood out, not only for his skill as a warrior, but for his cunning and courage. That man was Euric, the king of the Visigoths. Before we continue this story, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. Leave your like, and don't forget to comment on what you think of this content. Euric was not born a prince of a stable kingdom. He was the son of Theodoric III, a military leader of the Visigoths. But the throne was not guaranteed. The Visigoths, who were a barbarian people, had been allies of Rome in some campaigns, but with the fall of the empire, they found themselves masters of their own destiny. The struggle for power between different Visigothic leaders was constant, and Euric's position was no different. He would need to prove that he was up to the responsibility. It was in the midst of these internal and external struggles that Euric, with his strategy and skill in battle, emerged as the natural leader for the Visigoths. In 466, after the death of his father, Euric managed not only to assume the throne, but to get the Visigothic nobles to support him as the legitimate king. It was not an easy achievement, as he had to face challenges from other leaders and even from other Germanic peoples who were around. But Euric, with his bravery and vision of the future, was able to unite the Visigoths under his rule, laying the foundations for the empire he would found. Little by little, he began to make strategic decisions that demonstrated his capabilities not only as a warrior, but also as a ruler. He was no ordinary king who simply fought. He was a man who knew that for his people to survive and prosper, it took more than brute force. He proved himself capable of creating important alliances, as well as dealing with internal and external issues in a shrewd manner. And so, with his vision and ambition, Euric began an era of conquest for the Visigoths, consolidating their power and ensuring that their lineage would not be just a forgotten page in history. But Euric's story doesn't end there. He still had a lot to achieve. When Euric assumed the throne in 466, the Visigoths were far from the powerful force they had been in the first decades after their entry into European history. During the height of the Roman Empire, the Visigoths had been known for their military prowess and for being allies of the empire. But with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Visigoths now found themselves alone, without an empire to support their position. They were scattered across many regions, lacking a cohesive unity, and this had a direct impact on the power and influence of the Visigothic people. The fall of the Roman Empire created a power vacuum in Europe, and the Visigoths found themselves in an unstable territory. Several Germanic tribes, such as the Vandals and Suevi, were competing for the same land. In addition, Rome, now fragmented and weakened, still tried to exert some control over its former provinces, and this resulted in constant clashes with the barbarian peoples who had settled in the former lands of the empire. The Visigoths were in decline, both politically and militarily, and when Euric assumed the throne, he found a people divided and threatened by external and internal forces. He had to reunite the Visigoths, strengthen their army, and most importantly, restore the confidence of his people. Euric's task was monumental, and although the Visigothic people were still feared in some parts of Europe, their position was not secure. The kingdom was threatened by other Germanic tribes and by the internal decay that had set in after the death of Euric's father Theodoric. It is in this moment of fragility that Euric begins to show his strength and skill, and over the next few years, he would do the unthinkable. He would begin to restore and expand the power of the Visigoths, to the point of building one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The Battle of Vouillé, fought in 507, is one of the most significant and dramatic battles in Visigothic history. After years of domination in the regions of Gaul and Hispania, the Visigoths now faced a powerful new threat, Clovis I, the king of the Franks. Clovis, who had consolidated his authority over the Frankish tribes, wanted to expand his territory southward, especially into Gaul, which was under Visigothic control. This conflict would culminate in one of the greatest battles of the time, and the defeat of the Visigoths would have profound consequences for the future of the kingdom. The battle took place at Vouillé, a town near the city of Poitiers, in what is now France. Euric, who had already faced several challenges in consolidating Visigothic power, prepared his armies for the confrontation. But he had no idea that this battle would change the fate of his kingdom. Clovis, a skilled and determined strategist, led his army with strength and determination, and his victory in the battle was undoubtedly one of the most decisive in his rise to power. The Visigothic army, under the command of Euric, or his son Alaric II, who succeeded him after his death, fought bravely, but the Franks proved superior. Clovis's military strategy was much more effective, and he was able to defeat the Visigoths, capturing vast lands in Gaul. As a result of this defeat, the Visigoths lost control of important territories, including the city of Bordeaux, and southern Gaul was now dominated by the Franks. For the Visigoths, this defeat was devastating. The battle meant not only the loss of crucial territory, but also the weakening of the Visigoths' political and military position in Europe. Clovis's victory solidified the power of the Franks, who continued to expand their domain, eventually forming what would become the Frankish Kingdom, one of the leading medieval powers. But even with the loss, the Visigoths did not disappear. The defeat of Vouillé forced Euric, or his successors, to concentrate his efforts on the defense of Hispania, where the Visigothic kingdom would continue to grow, away from the threat of the Franks. The battle also demonstrated the military skill of Clovis, but it also showed the resilience of the Visigoths, who, although defeated, did not lose the ability to rebuild. Euric, despite the defeat, was undeterred. He understood that his only chance of keeping the Visigothic kingdom alive was to consolidate his power base in Hispania, ensuring that the Visigoths would become an even stronger and more unified force in the future. And it was precisely this base, later on, that would ensure the survival of the Visigothic kingdom for many years to come. After the significant defeat at the Battle of Vouillé, Euric found himself faced with a great challenge to save the Visigothic kingdom and ensure its survival. With the loss of the vast lands of Gaul to the Franks, he realized that the future of his people would depend on the consolidation and expansion of his dominion in Hispania, a region that until then had been divided among various peoples and tribes, such as the Suevi, the Vandals, and the remaining Romans. It was at this time of crisis that Euric showed himself to be a far-sighted strategist. He turned his efforts to Hispania, where, despite resistance, the Visigoths had managed to establish a strong and lasting power. The region, which had been part of the Roman Empire, was in a state of instability, with various barbarian peoples vying for control. Euric, however, knew how to take advantage of this weakness to expand his domain. He united the Visigoths and began to dismantle the resistance, one by one, beginning to take control of the southern regions of Hispania, including the areas around Toledo, which would become the base of Visigothic power in the Iberian Peninsula. One of Euric's main strategies was to adapt Roman tactics, using fortifications and building a network of strong cities to protect his kingdom. He used his army effectively, taking advantage of the military power of the Visigoths, known for their fighting skills, to impose his authority over the tribes that were not yet under his control. In addition, he also made alliances with other barbarian peoples, such as the Suevi, who were located in the northwest of the peninsula, ensuring a balance of power and preventing these peoples from turning against him. Euric not only conquered lands, he also worked to ensure the stability and security of his new kingdom. He strengthened the region's economy by encouraging trade and diplomatic relations with other nations, including the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, which offered political support and recognition. By consolidating power in Hispania, Euric transformed the Visigoths from a displaced people who lived off invasions into a significant territorial power, capable of rivaling other kingdoms and empires of the time. Hispania would then become the heart of the Visigothic Kingdom, which would continue to flourish in the following decades, even after Euric's death. The conquest of Hispania, therefore, was not only a military victory, but also a strategic achievement that ensured the survival of the Visigothic Kingdom, creating a solid base for Euric's successors. This territory would be the scene of many other battles and conflicts, but it was there that Euric's legacy as a great conqueror and leader of his people truly took hold. In addition to being a great military leader, Euric was also one of the first Germanic kings to realize that, in order to ensure the stability and continuity of his kingdom, force of arms alone was not enough. It was necessary to establish a solid legal basis, something that would unite the Visigothic people and maintain internal order. This was one of Euric's most lasting legacies. He was responsible for creating the Code of Euric, a set of laws that not only helped to organize Visigothic society, but also marked an important step in the evolution of law among the Germanic peoples. The Code of Euric was crucial because it was one of the first examples of an attempt to systematize laws in a codified format. In an era where laws were often passed down orally and varied greatly from region to region, the code brought about an important level of uniformity. The idea of codifying laws not only stabilized Visigothic rule, but also began to shape the way the Germanic kingdoms dealt with law and justice. The code addressed civil, commercial, and criminal matters, and established the rules of coexistence between the Visigoths and the Romans who lived under their rule. One of the most notable aspects of the code was that it reflected the coexistence of different cultures and religions. Since the Visigoths were predominantly Arian, while the Romans and many other inhabitants of Hispania were Catholic, the laws needed to be flexible enough to accommodate religious differences. The Code of Euric did not impose the superiority of one religion over another, but attempted to create peaceful coexistence between the different sects, establishing clear rules for religious disputes and maintaining public order. Furthermore, Euric understood that justice could not be merely a tool of the king or the nobles. The creation of local courts and the regulation of how disputes would be resolved at different levels of society helped to cement the people's trust in the Visigothic government. The implementation of these laws helped to create greater cohesion within the kingdom and strengthen the king's authority as subjects came to trust the kingdom's judicial system and institutions more. This effort to create a code of laws also reflected Euric's ambition to make the Visigothic kingdom more organized and efficient, something that was more than just a collection of warring tribes. He wanted to create a structured nation with laws that governed everyone, Visigoths and Romans alike. This vision was an important step toward the thorifene of a more cohesive and functional medieval kingdom, which would become a model for Euric's successors. The creation of the Code of Euric is undoubtedly one of the most important milestones of his reign. Although many of the laws were lost over time, the concept of a codified legal system spread throughout Europe, influencing other kingdoms and becoming a basis for the development of medieval law. Euric's religious policy was one of the most complex and controversial aspects of his reign. As leader of the Visigoths, Euric inherited a tradition of Arianism, a form of Christianity that denied the full divinity of Christ, something that was at odds with the Orthodox Christianity that would later become the dominant form of faith in Europe. Arianism was a legacy of Germanic and Visigothic origins, and many of the Germanic leaders of the time adopted this belief as part of their religious identity. However, this placed Euric in a difficult position, especially in relation to the Roman Catholic Church and the Romans living in his kingdom. As king, Euric had to deal with the growing influence of the Catholic Church, which was becoming increasingly powerful in the region. The Roman Church, although fragmented in the late Roman Empire, was trying to tollo its authority, and this would pose a problem for Arian monarchs such as the Visigoths. Euric saw Arianism as the legitimate faith, both for his people and to ensure their independence from Rome and the Catholic Church, which sought to spread its doctrine throughout the empire. Although there was no large-scale violent persecution of Catholics, Euric sought to maintain the primacy of Arianism within his kingdom. He prohibited Catholic practices in some areas and aimed to weaken the position of the Catholic Church, especially by opposing the Catholic clergy who were already establishing themselves among the Romans. However, this religious policy also presented challenges for Euric, as he had to balance the internal cohesion of his kingdom, which included a significant population of Roman Catholics, with the interests of his own Arian faith. Another important aspect was that Euric was not just a warrior or military leader. He also played an active role in shaping the religious beliefs of his people. He sought to establish a system of control over religious practices, promoting Arianism, but also dealing with internal divisions between different religious groups. During his reign, he took steps to ensure that Arian bishops dominated the Visigothic Church, and that the Catholic Church was restricted, especially in relation to clergy who opposed his views. However, Euric's religious policy was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it helped to strengthen Visigothic control over the territory, creating a unique religious identity for the kingdom. On the other hand, it ended up creating internal divisions and difficulties for the Visigoths, as the Roman popes began to exert increasing influence on European politics, which would later result in conflicts with Euric's successors, such as Alaric II, who would have to deal with pressure from the Catholic Church. Euric's approach to religion was crucial to the history of the Visigoths, because later Visigothic kings would face increasing pressure to convert to Catholicism, which would become the dominant religion in medieval Europe. The rise of Catholicism in the Visigothic Kingdom would be one of the central issues that would affect the future of the kingdom after Euric's death. Although the Western Roman Empire had fallen decades before Euric assumed the Visigothic throne, relations with Rome were still complex and fraught with tension. The city of Rome was no longer the center of world power, but the Roman legacy continued to influence the barbarian peoples who had settled in its former provinces. For the Visigoths, the issue with Rome was twofold. On the one hand, there was a need to maintain independence from their former masters, while on the other, there was a desire to continue to seize the lands that Rome had left behind. Euric, as leader of the Visigoths, had no interest in submitting to any authority from Rome, especially at a time when the Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, was still trying to regain control over the western provinces. The Visigoths, who had once been allies of Rome, now saw the Romans as a weakened force, and so sought to expand their own power. In diplomatic terms, Euric sought to strengthen his kingdom by using Rome as an example of what he did not want. He did not accept the authority of the Eastern Roman Empire over his lands, especially regarding its religious policies, such as the Byzantine Empire's insistence on spreading Orthodox Christianity, in contrast to the Arianism that Euric advocated. By maintaining control of Hispania and parts of Gaul, the Visigoths avoided direct interference from Rome and established themselves as an independent power on the European scene. However, although the Visigoths under Euric resisted Roman attempts to influence or control their policies, the weakening of the Roman Empire also presented a strategic opportunity for the Visigothic Kingdom. By expanding into lands previously controlled by Rome, Euric could demonstrate to the world that the Visigoths were no longer just marauding barbarians, but an established power capable of actively controlling vast territories. However, the conflicts with Rome were not only political and military, but also cultural and religious. Euric, with his support of Arianism, was a controversial figure for both Romans and Orthodox Christians. This religious conflict was one of the reasons why the Visigoths distanced themselves even further from Rome, rejecting conversion attempts and the influence of the Catholic Church. The distancing from Rome and the maintenance of their religious identity were factors that shaped Euric's reign, and also the future of the Visigoths in medieval Europe. The Romans, for their part, also had other internal problems. The Eastern Roman Empire was more focused on protecting its own borders and restoring what had been lost from the empire. This gave the Visigoths the freedom to act without the constant threat of direct intervention. This independence lasted, however, only as long as the Romans were in decline. When the Byzantine Empire later reorganized, this resistance by the Visigoths to Roman rule became a focal point of future territorial disputes. In 4084, Euric, the great king of the Visigoths, died after a reign of almost 2 decades. His death marked the end of an era of great conquests and challenges for the Visigothic people, but it also further cemented their importance in the history of medieval Europe. His death, however, did not mean an abrupt end to the Visigothic kingdom, but rather the beginning of a process of succession that would bring new leaders and eventually new challenges. When Euric died, he left the Visigothic throne to his son, Alaric II, a prince who had been educated at his father's court and who had been groomed to take control of the kingdom. Alaric II was already an important political figure within the kingdom, having assisted his father in several military campaigns and with the administration of the territory. However, the transition of power was not a simple one. Eurico's death generated a certain instability among the different factions within the Visigothic kingdom. Some of the old rivalries and power struggles within the Visigothic aristocracy resurfaced, which ultimately made Alaric II's reign more difficult. Although Alaric was seen as the legitimate successor, he did not have the same charisma or military skill as his father. This resulted in a temporary weakening of Visigothic power, especially in the face of increasing external pressure. Euric's death also had an impact on the Visigothic kingdom's relations with the other Germanic peoples and with the Catholic Church. During Euric's reign, the Visigoths were establishing their own religious identity with Arianism. But after his death, his successors began to face increasing pressure to adopt Catholicism, a religion that was gaining traction throughout Europe. The reign of Alaric II, who succeeded Euric, would be marked by attempts to balance these religious and political tensions, a task that proved more difficult than it first seemed. Despite these challenges, Euric's legacy as a strong and visionary leader continued to influence the Visigoths for decades to come. His ability to consolidate Visigothic power in Hispania and his courage in confronting external enemies were not forgotten. His code of laws, created during his reign, would continue to be an important reference for Visigothic rulers after his death. In short, although Eurico's death represented a turning point for the Visigothic kingdom, his impact lasted for many years. He was a king who, despite his flaws and challenges, left an indelible legacy in the history of the Visigoths and in the formation of medieval Europe. Euric's death did not mean the end of his influence over the Visigothic kingdom. On the contrary, he had laid the foundations for a power that would endure for generations. Under his leadership, the Visigoths were transformed from a scattered and declining people into one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe. The impact of his reign was profound and lasting, both in terms of politics and in terms of social and religious structure. When Euric ascended the throne, the Visigoths were in a vulnerable position, divided among several tribes and facing external threats. However, his skill as a military strategist and diplomat united the Visigothic tribes and allowed them to dominate vast regions, including Hispania and parts of Gaul. He consolidated the Visigothic presence in the Iberian Peninsula, making it the base of the kingdom for his successors. Hispania would be the stronghold that would sustain the Visigothic kingdom for centuries, and its transformation into a regional power was one of Euric's greatest legacies. In addition to his military prowess, Euric's reign was also notable for the introduction of the Code of Euric, one of the first attempts to codify laws among the Germanic peoples. This attempt to create a cohesive legal basis for governing the Visigothic kingdom was influential not only during his reign, but also after his death, when Euric's successors continued to rely on the laws he established. The code helped to organize Visigothic society and ensure justice for both the Visigoths and the Romans living under their rule. The introduction of a more structured legal system was a milestone in the political development of the kingdom. In the religious field, Euric was responsible for solidifying Arianism as the dominant faith in the Visigothic kingdom. Although this created tensions with the Catholic Church, especially in the Roman provinces under his control, the king was steadfast in his defense of Arianism, maintaining it as the official faith. This religious stance was undoubtedly one of the most divisive aspects of his reign, and Euric's later successors would face increasing pressure to adopt Catholicism, which would prove to be one of the central issues for the future of the Visigothic kingdom. Euric's impact on the Visigothic kingdom was therefore immense. He transformed the Visigoths into a respected political and military force, established a legal basis that would sustain the kingdom, and shaped the kingdom's religious identity. Even after his death, the echoes of his decisions can be seen in the generations that followed, who inherited the consolidated kingdom and the institutions he helped to found. Euric's legacy then was not only about his military achievements, but also about the way he structured and unified his people to create a strong kingdom capable of withstanding the adversities of a changing Europe. During Eurico's reign, one of the most intelligent political strategies he adopted was the use of alliances and marriages to consolidate his power and ensure the stability of the Visigothic kingdom. Marriage, an important diplomatic tool in any era, was especially relevant in the medieval era, where politics and international relations were often shaped by such unions. Euric knew exactly when and with whom to make alliances, and this was essential to protect the Visigothic kingdom and ensure its expansion. An important example of this was his alliance with other Germanic peoples and neighboring tribes, such as the Suevi, who were settled in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula. He also understood the importance of diplomatic relations with the Eastern Roman Empire, seeking to ensure that the Visigoths would have a respectable and independent role in Europe, without being dominated by Byzantine forces. In addition to military alliances, marriages also played a strategic role in dynastic relations. Eurico sought to ensure that his children and other members of the royal family married important figures in Europe, establishing ties that would strengthen Visigothic power. This type of dynastic policy not only helped to strengthen the position of the kingdom, but also to establish a network of support between the different royal houses, which was essential in a period of constant instability. Marriages were not merely arrangements of convenience, but also symbols of power and prestige. By ensuring that members of the Visigothic royal family were married to influential figures, Euric increased the visibility and credibility of his kingdom throughout Europe. These dynastic alliances therefore not only protected the kingdom against external enemies, but also strengthened the internal cohesion of the Visigothic kingdom, creating a network of alliances that could be called upon in times of crisis. Euric's marriages with the nobility and other peoples, as well as the military alliances he formed, allowed the Visigoths to establish themselves as a power that was not only feared, but also respected by other kingdoms and empires. These familial and political ties made the Visigoths a force to be reckoned with in medieval Europe, and helped ensure that even after Euric's death, the Visigothic kingdom had a solid foundation on which to continue its existence. These strategic moves are a clear example of how Eurico went beyond military force and used diplomacy and marriages as essential tools to strengthen his reign. The Code of Euric was one of the most significant contributions of his reign to the history of law in medieval Europe. It was not only a codification of the laws of the Visigothic kingdom, but also a reflection of his views on social organization and the structure of governance. The importance of this code was not limited to being merely a collection of rules, but rather an attempt to ensure that justice was distributed equitably among all the subjects of the kingdom, both the Visigoths and the Romans who had been conquered. The Code of Euric emerged in a period of transition between the ancient Roman legal systems and the new systems being shaped by the Germanic tribes. Before this, laws had been largely oral and based on tribal customs, which resulted in an inconsistent application of justice. Euric, with his strategic and administrative vision, understood that in order to consolidate the power and stability of his kingdom, something more formal and structured was needed. The code addressed a variety of aspects of daily life and the administration of the kingdom, including matters of property, contracts, crimes, and punishments. It also reflected the religious tensions of the time, such as the differences between Arianism, which the Visigoths followed, and Catholicism, which was practiced by the Romans under their rule. The Code of Euric attempted to create a coexistence between these two groups, regulating interactions between them in a way that maintained peace, but always with a clear favoritism of the Visigoths and their Arian faith. One of the most notable aspects of the code was its attempt to ensure that the Romans did not have the same legal rights as the Visigoths in some areas. For example, property and inheritance laws were often more favorable to the Visigoths than to the Romans, reflecting Euric's concern to consolidate Visigothic power and prevent the Romans from having excessive influence. Furthermore, the code was an early example of an effort to unite the different groups within a kingdom by creating a common legal basis that helped to avoid internal conflict. Although the Code of Euric was an important milestone in the history of Germanic law, it was also a reflection of the difficulties of integrating different cultures under a single government. The code was not perfect, and many aspects of it were later altered or replaced by more modern codes. However, it set a precedent for other Germanic kings and influenced the laws of many European kingdoms for centuries to come. Euric's code not only helped stabilize the Visigothic kingdom during his reign, but also had a lasting impact on the development of medieval law. It paved the way for future attempts at legal codification and established a basis for the efficient administration of the Visigothic kingdom. The relationship between the Visigoths and the Franks was one of the most crucial dynamics during Euric's reign, and the impact of this relationship played a significant role in the course of the history of the Germanic peoples. Although Euric consolidated Visigothic power in Hispania and parts of Gaul, he could not prevent the rise of Clovis I, the king of the Franks, who was determined to expand his territory and assert his authority over neighboring kingdoms, including the Visigothic kingdom. Clovis I was a central figure in the unification of the Frankish tribes and the strengthening of the Frankish kingdom, and his expansionist vision led him directly into conflict with the Visigoths. The major battle between the forces of Euric and Clovis occurred in 507 at the famous Battle of Vouillé. Although the battle was fought after Euric's reign, he died in 4084. The rise of the Franks and conflicts with them began much earlier. The rivalry between the Visigoths and the Franks was motivated by a number of factors. First, Gaul, a region that the Visigoths considered part of their domain, was also a strategic land rich in resources. Clovis, as he consolidated his power, saw Gaul as an essential part of his plans for the unification of Western Europe. The growing power of the Franks posed a direct threat to the Visigoths, who needed to protect their territories and their conquests in the region. Although the Franks and Visigoths shared a Germanic origin, their political and religious views were quite different. Clovis, for example, was a Catholic, while Euric, as discussed above, was an Arian. This religious difference was not just a matter of faith, but also a reflection of the political tensions between the two kingdoms. The growing influence of the Catholic Church, which opposed Arianism, made the rivalry between the two peoples more than a territorial dispute. It also became a struggle for religious supremacy. Despite the rise of the Franks under Clovis, Euric managed to maintain military superiority for a time and established a series of alliances that ensured the stability of the Visigoths. He was not only a military leader, but also a diplomatic strategist who understood that the survival of his people depended on well-planned alliances. Even so, the increasing pressure of the Franks on the Visigothic territories would make conflict between the two powers inevitable, culminating in the Visigothic defeat at the Battle of Vosges, where the Franks emerged victorious. The defeat in the battle, although occurring after Euric's death, was a direct consequence of the growing threat posed by the Franks. Clovis's victory meant the loss of vital territories for the Visigoths in Gaul, and although the Visigoths still retained considerable power in Hispania, this defeat weakened their hold and caused the Visigoths to concentrate on the defense of southern Europe. Euric, therefore, not only faced internal and religious challenges during his reign, but also had to deal with the rise of a powerful new enemy, the Franks. His skill in managing conflicts with the Franks and his attempt to protect the Visigothic territories would lay the foundation for future generations who would have to face the consequences of this rivalry. The Suebi were another major challenge to the Visigoths during the reign of Euric. Settled in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula, in a region that would later correspond to part of present-day Galicia, the Suebi were a Germanic people who had also settled in the lands of the Roman Empire after its collapse. Although the Suebi were not as powerful as the Visigoths, they posed a constant threat, especially since their actions could destabilize Visigothic territory or create internal disputes. While the Visigoths were consolidating their position in Hispania, the Suebi sought to expand their territory and ensure their own survival in a highly competitive environment. The Iberian Peninsula was divided between several groups, and the Suebi, with their kingdom in the northwest, were in a strategic position to challenge the growing Visigothic hegemony. The Suebi were also Arians, like the Visigoths, but this did not mean that they were automatic allies. The issue of religion did not resolve all conflicts between these peoples, especially considering that the Suebi were not as disciplined or organized as the Visigoths, and their actions were sometimes more unpredictable. Euric, as king, knew that allowing the Suebi to expand or become a direct threat to Visigothic power in Hispania was not an option. This would mean a division of the Iberian territory and would weaken Visigothic rule in the region. In response, he adopted a more aggressive stance towards the Suebi, seeking not only to protect Visigothic territories, but also to weaken any resistance that might arise from the Suebi in the future. The clashes between the Visigoths and the Suebi, especially during the early years of Euric's reign, included a series of battles and military actions that resulted in a Visigothic victory. Over the course of Euric's reign, the Visigothic Kingdom was able to drive the Suebi out of several areas, consolidating Visigothic control over much of the Iberian Peninsula. Euric's goal was not only to defeat the Suebi, but to ensure that they would not be able to challenge his authority in the future. In addition to military force, Euric also used diplomacy to deal with the Suebi. He knew that while direct confrontation was necessary in many cases, diplomacy could avoid a prolonged war and allow the Visigoths to maintain control without having to expend too many resources on constant conflict. This approach, then, was a combination of force and negotiation, something that Euric mastered masterfully. By the end of Euric's reign, the Suebi had been crushed as a significant threat to Visigothic authority. The northwestern territory of the Iberian Peninsula was consolidated under Visigothic rule, which helped to ensure the stability and continuity of the kingdom. Although tensions continued in other areas, especially with the Franks, the Visigoths were now firmly established in Hispania, and the dispute with the Suebi was one of the last military barriers to their consolidation. Although Euric ruled during a period of instability and challenge, he left a lasting legacy that would shape the history of the Visigoths and even the political structure of medieval Europe. When we think of Euric, we think of a leader who was able to transform his kingdom, not only with his military skills, but also with his strategic vision and administrative thinking. His impact was profound, and his decisions reverberated for many years after his death. Euric was the archetypal warrior ruler, but he was also someone who understood that power could not be sustained by force of arms alone. He knew that in order to ensure the stability of the Visigothic kingdom, it would be necessary to establish a structure that was both military and legal. His Code of Euric, as discussed above, was a landmark in the history of Germanic law, and his implementation of the code helped to create a more structured society, even in the midst of the chaos that dominated Europe. Furthermore, Euric laid the foundations for a kingdom that, after his death, would continue to expand and prosper in Hispania. His skill in consolidating the Visigothic presence in the Iberian Peninsula not only ensured that the Visigoths would survive, but also that they would become a political power on the European stage. By protecting Hispania from external invasion, and by reorganizing the Visigothic government, he left a solid foundation for his successors, such as Euric II, who would continue his policy of strengthening the kingdom. Euric's victory over the Suevi and the creation of a cohesive nation with a defined legal system were not only feats of war, but also of diplomacy. He demonstrated that the survival of the Visigothic kingdom depended not only on brute force, but also on its ability to govern and create a structured empire. By consolidating Visigothic power in Hispania, he had a lasting impact on subsequent generations, who continued to maintain the Visigothic kingdom as a force in medieval Europe until its fall in the 8th century. In terms of cultural legacy, Eurico's influence can also be seen in the way he dealt with religious issues. His stance on Arianism, although a divisive factor in relation to Romans and later the Catholic Church, also helped to shape the Visigothic identity as a distinct people with their own beliefs that, for a time, maintained the political and religious independence of the Visigoths. Eurico's religious policy can therefore be seen as an attempt to assert the identity of the Visigothic kingdom at a time of great religious change in Europe. However, he also sowed the seeds of the future conflict between Arianism and Catholicism, an issue that would be a constant challenge for the successors of his kingdom. In the end, Eurico's legacy lies not only in the military victories or the laws he implemented, but in the way he founded a kingdom that would last more than 2 centuries after his death. Even with the challenges the Visigoths faced after his death, his impact as a leader and lawgiver cannot be understated. When looking at Eurico's story, it becomes clear that he was more than just a warrior king or a conqueror. He was a visionary, a leader who was able to see beyond the immediate challenges of his time and prepare his people for the future. His reign was a turning point for the Visigoths, as under his leadership the Visigothic kingdom grew from a series of isolated tribes to an organized, structured and respected power in Europe. Eurico was able to adapt to the changing world around him, and he used not only his military strength, but also his diplomatic and administrative skills to consolidate his power. He understood that the survival of the Visigothic kingdom would depend not only on victories in battle, but on the creation of a cohesive legal system, strategic alliances, and an efficient government. Eurico's code was not just a codification of laws, but an attempt to establish a new model of governance for a rapidly changing world, and its implementation helped ensure that justice was administered more uniformly throughout his kingdom. By expanding Visigothic rule into Hispania, he not only strengthened the kingdom, but also solidified the territorial base that would ensure the continuation of the Visigothic Empire after his death. Although the defeat at the Battle of Vuz was a great loss, Euric demonstrated the resilience needed to ensure that the Visigoths were not destroyed by the rise of the Franks. Instead, the kingdom was redirected to Hispania, where it would establish a lasting base for the future. Eurico's impact on religion was also profound. His stance on Arianism helped define Visigothic identity, while also creating conflict with the Catholic Church, an issue that would continue to haunt the Visigoths for a long time. Resistance to Catholicism was in many ways a struggle for religious and political autonomy, an attempt to preserve Visigothic traditions in a world increasingly dominated by the Roman Church. However, Euric's legacy goes beyond his victories and defeats. He was one of the first Germanic kings to attempt to shape the history of his people in a way that was more than just a succession of battles and conflicts. He was a visionary who, by establishing a legal system and intelligently administering the Visigothic Kingdom, paved the way for the continuation of a power that, despite subsequent challenges, would remain a major force in medieval Europe. Euric may not be as widely remembered as other great kings in history, but his importance in shaping medieval Europe cannot be underestimated. His reign is a testament to how the vision of a single leader can transform the history of a people and ensure that their legacy endures for centuries. Did you like this story? Comment, like and subscribe to the channel. This is very important to us.